Play this, you filthy mutt!
Dr. Eleanor Whitfield grabbed a battered violin case from behind the podium and hurled it across the stage. It cracked against the floor and tumbled to Vincent Brooks's feet. 24.
Look at him.
Black.
So
Scholarship student. The only second-hand blazer in a room full of black tie. 400 people watched.
Scared? Pick it up. Or does the stray not know how to fetch?
His fists
I'm
clenched.
not your role animal.
His voice came out low, steady. The room laughed. She laughed louder.
I'm not your animal.
Nobody stood up for him.
Then prove it. Play if you even can.
He knelt down, opened the case, lifted the cheap violin. And what he played on that $40 instrument? It didn't just silence the room. It woke up a ghost that Dr. Whitfield thought she'd buried a long, long time ago. But before we get there, before the gala, before the stage, before any of it, you need to know who Vincent Brooks was the morning everything changed. 4:45 a.m., West Philadelphia, a studio apartment smaller than most people's closets. One window, one radiator that clanked like a broken drumbeat all night. The paint on the ceiling was peeling in long curls, and the smell of instant coffee and plaster dust had soaked into every surface so deep it was part of the walls now. Vincent sat on the edge of his bed, which was really just a mattress on the floor, and pulled on his jeans. Same pair as yesterday, same pair as the day before that. On the back of the door hung a thrift store blazer, navy blue, re-stitched at the left shoulder where the seam had given up. It was the only blazer he owned. He wore it to classes, to recitals, to every event where the conservatory expected him to look like he belonged. He grabbed the violin case leaning against the wall by the door. Not the kind of case you'd see in a catalog. The leather was cracked, the zipper stuck halfway, and the handle had been wrapped in duct tape twice. But the instrument inside, that was different. That instrument had a voice. His father's voice. The L train rattled past his window. The whole apartment shook. He didn't notice anymore. Outside, the streets were still dark. Wet. The kind of cold that doesn't hit you all at once, but crawls in through your shoes and sits in your bones. Vincent walked 6 blocks east, past the check cashing place, past the laundromat with the busted sign, past the corner where Mr. Walton sold newspapers from a folding chair, even though nobody bought newspapers anymore. He walked until he reached Mount Olive Baptist Church. The door was always unlocked before dawn. Pastor Hendricks had given him a key 3 years ago, back when Vincent was 21 and had nowhere else to practice. The acoustics weren't great. Low ceiling, damp walls. The sound bounced in strange places. But it was quiet. And it was free. And that was enough. Vincent opened the case, rosined the bow, tucked the violin under his chin. And he played. If you'd been standing outside that church at 5 in the morning, you would have stopped walking. Not because the music was loud. It wasn't. It was because it reached through the walls, through the heavy wooden door, through the wet morning air. A single violin, played in an empty church, sounding like it was grieving and praying at the same time. That was Vincent Brooks every morning, before the sun came up, before the city woke, before anyone at the Aston Conservatory of Music knew or cared that he existed. Now, his mother. Dolores Brooks worked the night shift in the custodial department at Jefferson Memorial Hospital, mopping floors, scrubbing surgical suites, emptying bins that smelled like iodine, and worse. She'd been doing it for 19 years. Her knees were bad. Her back was worse. She never complained. Not once. Every month she wired $260 to Vincent's landlord. That was the gap between his scholarship and the rent. She ate lunch at the hospital cafeteria because the meals were discounted for staff. She hadn't bought herself new shoes in 3 years. When Vincent called her, every Sunday, 7 p.m. sharp, she never asked about money. She asked about his playing. She asked if he'd eaten. She asked if the church was still letting him practice. And every call ended the same way. "You play for the ones who can't anymore, baby. You remember that." She was talking about his father, Clarence Brooks. If you grew up in West Philadelphia in the 90s and you walked past the right street corner on the right Saturday afternoon, you heard him before you saw him. A tall man in a flannel shirt, eyes closed, playing a violin on the sidewalk like the sidewalk was Carnegie Hall. No case open for tips, no sign, just a man and a melody and whatever God put in his hands that day. Clarence was self-taught, never read a note of formal theory in his life, learned by ear, by feel, by listening to records on a second-hand turntable until the grooves wore smooth. He played at churches, weddings, funerals. He played for free more often than not. People in the neighborhood called him the Fiddle Man. He'd smile when they said it, never corrected them. He composed, too. Not on manuscript paper. He couldn't afford it. He used the backs of church bulletins, napkins, the margins of his daughter's old school notebooks. Melodies in pencil, harmonics scribbled sideways. A whole world of music written in a handwriting only Vincent could read. One piece stood above the rest. A sonata for solo violin. 14 pages. No title, just a date. The year Clarence turned 30. And a small note at the bottom of the last page. For V, when he's ready. Vincent found it in a shoebox in his mother's closet when he was 16. He taught himself to play it that same summer, note by note, page by page. Alone in his bedroom with the door locked, hearing his father's voice in every phrase. It was the most beautiful piece of music he had ever heard. Wild, aching, full of something that formal training could never teach, because it came from a place that had nothing to do with technique and everything to do with living. Clarence died of a stroke on a Tuesday morning. He was 41. He left behind a widow, a 12-year-old son, one violin, and a shoebox full of music that nobody in the world knew existed. Nobody, except, as it turned out, one person who had no right to know it at all. The Aston Conservatory of Music sat on a tree-lined block in Center City, Philadelphia. Limestone columns, iron gates, the kind of building that whispered old money before you even walked through the door. Vincent was one of 3 black students in the performance program. He sat in the back of every lecture. He practiced in the smallest rooms, the ones with no windows, the ones nobody else wanted. His playing stopped people in hallways. Students would press their ears against practice room doors, holding their breath. But when the showcase lists went up each semester, his name was never on them. His closest friend, Naomi Sullivan, a cellist with a sharp tongue and 0 patience for politics, told him straight, "You play better than anyone in this building, V, and they know it. That's exactly why your name's not on that list." Vincent shrugged. "I just need to get through the year, keep the scholarship, keep my head down." Naomi shook her head. "You keep your head down long enough, people start thinking you don't have one." She wasn't wrong. But Vincent had learned a long time ago that for someone who looked like him, in a place like this, being invisible was safer than being seen. The gatekeeper to every performance slot, every competition recommendation, every career-making introduction at the conservatory was one person, Dr. Eleanor Whitfield. And that name, in this story, changes everything. Dr. Eleanor Whitfield didn't walk into rooms. She arrived. You heard her before you saw her. The sharp click of designer heels on marble. Steady, deliberate, like a metronome set to a tempo only she controlled. Students in the hallway would flatten themselves against the walls when that sound came around the corner. Not out of respect, out of something closer to survival. She was 58 years old, tall, thin in a way that looked expensive, silver hair cut to the jawline, never a strand out of place. She wore charcoal blazers that cost more than Vincent's rent, and a pair of gold-rimmed glasses she adjusted before every critique, the way a surgeon picks up a scalpel, slowly, with precision, and without the slightest concern for what comes next. Whitfield was the chair of the performance department at Aston Conservatory, three-time recipient of the National Arts Medallion, board member of the Philadelphia Philharmonic Society. Her name was etched into the limestone above the recital hall entrance, not because she donated the building, but because someone who donated the building owed her a favor. She had an entourage, not officially, but wherever Whitfield went, people followed. Department assistants, junior faculty, and always, Theodore Grimes, her graduate protege, a tall, pale young man with thin lips and a permanent expression of mild agreement. Theodore fetched her water. Theodore echoed her opinions in faculty meetings. Theodore laughed at her remarks exactly half a second after she delivered them, like a shadow that found everything funny. When Whitfield spoke to students, she didn't look at them. She looked past them, at the wall, at her phone, at something more interesting that only she could see. Her feedback was legendary, not for its insight, for its cruelty. She once told a first-year flutist in front of the entire studio class, "If I wanted to hear that interpretation, I'd hand the sheet music to my housekeeper." The room went silent. She moved on to the next student without blinking. And if you were black, if you were brown, if you were anyone whose last name didn't come attached to a trust fund or a legacy admission, Whitfield had a special kind of invisibility reserved just for you. She didn't attack you. She simply acted as though you weren't there. Your recordings went unreviewed. Your recital applications vanished into a drawer. Your name was never spoken in recommendation meetings. When Vincent submitted a recording for the spring recital last year, a recording that had made Naomi cry the first time she heard it, Whitfield's written feedback was 4 words. Not conservatory standard. Next. She hadn't listened past the first 30 seconds. The file's playtime data proved it. But none of that, not the cruelty, not the politics, not the power, was the thing that kept Vincent awake at night. It was the music. The Whitfield Violin Sonata in D minor. It was her masterpiece. The composition that launched her career 28 years ago, when she was a young faculty member hungry for recognition. The piece had been performed at international competitions, recorded by soloists on 3 continents, taught in masterclasses from Juilliard to Vienna. Critics called it a once-in-a-generation work, raw, aching, structurally daring. Whitfield told the story of its creation in every interview. It came from a period of deep personal reflection, she'd say, adjusting her glasses. I locked myself in my studio for 3 weeks. No phone, no visitors, just me and the instrument. The sonata wrote itself. The world believed her. Vincent didn't, because every time he heard the Whitfield Sonata performed, at a recital, in a recording hummed by a student in the hallway, something in his chest clenched. The bowing patterns, the double-stop progression in the second movement, the way the melody descended in the bridge with that distinctive fingering, like a hand reaching down into deep water. He knew those patterns. He knew that fingering. He had played them 1,000 times, alone, in his bedroom. From 14 pages of pencil-written manuscript paper pulled from a shoebox in his mother's closet. One night, he told Naomi, played her both pieces back to back, his father's untitled sonata, then a recording of the Whitfield. Naomi sat very still for a long time. Then she said, "V, that's not a coincidence. That's a copy." "I know." "You'd need proof, real proof, dated manuscripts, witnesses, something." "I have the manuscript. It's dated. It's in his handwriting." And she's the most powerful person in this building. Vincent said nothing. Naomi leaned forward. So what are you going to do? He didn't have an answer. Not yet. But he carried his father's manuscript with him everywhere, folded inside the inner pocket of his blazer, pressed against his chest. Not because he had a plan, because he couldn't leave it behind, the way some people carry photographs of the dead. Just in case. Just to feel them close. The Aston Conservatory annual gala was the kind of event that existed to remind everyone in the room how much money they had, and how much the people outside the room didn't. The Grand Parkway Hotel ballroom. Gold leaf ceilings, a 12-foot chandelier that looked like frozen rain. Round tables draped in white linen, topped with orchid centerpieces that cost more than Vincent's monthly groceries. Champagne flutes catching light from every angle. The smell of expensive perfume and roasted lamb and old leather shoes that had never touched a sidewalk. 400 guests, donors, alumni, music critics, conductors, the kind of people who said marvelous without irony. And in the far corner, near the back wall, standing at a table he'd been assigned to, the one closest to the kitchen doors, Vincent Brooks. He'd borrowed dress shoes from a classmate, polished them twice, ironed his one blazer on the floor of his apartment because he didn't own an ironing board. He didn't bring his violin. This wasn't a performance. This was a fundraising banquet. He was here because Naomi told him he had to be. You're a scholarship student, V. They notice who shows up, and they definitely notice who doesn't. So he showed up. Naomi sat next to him. She looked good. Silver earrings, black dress, the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was. She kept one hand on Vincent's arm, like she could feel the tension radiating off him. Breathe, she whispered. It's just a room. It wasn't just a room. It was a room where everything he wasn't, wealthy, connected, white, was on display at every table. The crystal glass in his hand felt heavier than it should. He thought about the plastic cups at Mount Olive Baptist, the dust on his radiator, the instant coffee that was all he'd had since yesterday morning. He didn't belong here. He knew it. Everyone knew it. The stage lights dimmed. A spotlight hit the podium. Dean Harriet Caldwell stepped up to introduce the evening's honoree. Tonight we celebrate a woman whose contributions to this institution and to the art of music itself are nothing short of extraordinary. A video tribute rolled. Photographs of Whitfield at galas, at award ceremonies, at podiums around the world. Clips of soloists performing the Whitfield Violin Sonata, critics praising it, students quoting it. 28 years of a legacy built on 14 pages of someone else's pencil-written notes. Vincent's hand tightened around his glass. Naomi glanced at him. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Whitfield took the stage to a standing ovation. She accepted a crystal plaque, the Aston Lifetime Achievement Award, and held it up to the light like it was something she'd always known was coming. Her speech was 12 minutes of gracious humility that fooled everyone in the room, except the two people sitting at the table by the kitchen doors. When the applause faded, Whitfield didn't step down. She smiled, that particular smile, and leaned into the microphone. Before we return to the evening, I thought we might enjoy a bit of live music. After all, what is a conservatory gala without a demonstration of what we produce? She gestured to Theodore Grimes. He walked to the stage, picked up a borrowed violin, and tore through a Paganini caprice, fast, flashy, technically sharp. The crowd applauded politely. Theodore bowed like he'd just cured a disease. Then Whitfield's eyes swept the room. Slowly. Like a searchlight looking for something to land on, they landed on Vincent. Mr. Brooks. His name through the speakers sounded like a verdict. You've been so quiet this year. Surely our scholarship program has produced something worth hearing. The room turned. 400 faces found him. some curious, some amused, a few already pitying. And then came the violin. The cheap one, the battered case held together with tape. She grabbed it from behind the podium. She'd had it ready, she'd planned this, and hurled it across the stage. It cracked against the polished floor and tumbled end over end until it stopped at his feet. You already know what she said. You already know that nobody stood up. Professor Gerald Aston, 78 years old, white-haired, co-founder of the conservatory, sat 2 tables away. He set down his champagne glass. He didn't speak, but his eyes locked onto Vincent and didn't move. The room was waiting. Whitfield was smiling. The cheap violin lay at his feet like a dare. Would he walk away and let her win? Would he play on an instrument designed to make him fail? Or was there something inside that battered case that she never counted on? Time stopped. Not literally, but something in the room shifted. The air changed, the way it does right before a storm breaks. 400 people frozen mid-breath. Champagne going flat in glasses nobody was holding anymore. The chandelier humming above like it was the only thing still alive. Vincent stared at the violin on the floor. His mind went somewhere else. Somewhere far from this ballroom. Somewhere dark and warm and safe. He was 12 years old. Sitting on the front steps of his mother's house, his father's funeral had been that morning. The house was full of people, eating casseroles and whispering. Vincent had slipped outside because he couldn't breathe in there anymore. His mother found him. She didn't sit down. She just stood behind him, one hand on his shoulder, and said the thing she'd say 100 more times over the next 12 years. You play for the ones who can't anymore, baby. You remember that. He remembered. He remembered his father's hands. Long fingers, calloused at the tips from decades of pressing steel strings without a proper chin rest. Clarence Brooks never owned a fine violin, never held one. He played instruments that other people threw away. Yard sale finds, church donations, things with cracked bodies and missing pegs. And every single one of them sang in his hands. Every single one. Because it was never about the instrument. Vincent looked at the cheap violin at his feet. Cracked varnish, warped bridge, a string that was probably flat. $40, maybe less. His father would have picked it up without hesitating. His father would have made it sing. Then Vincent felt it. The manuscript pages inside his blazer pocket, pressed against his chest. 14 pages. His father's handwriting. The sonata that was stolen. The music that was buried. And something clicked. Quiet, clean, like a lock turning. She gave him a stage. She gave him a microphone. She gave him 400 witnesses. And she didn't even know it. Vincent stood up. The chair scraped against the marble floor. The sound cut through the silence like a blade. Naomi grabbed his wrist. "Vi, you don't have to." He looked at her, and for the first time all night, he wasn't afraid. "Yeah, I do." He walked to the stage. Every step echoed. He knelt down, opened the battered case, and lifted the cheap violin. He ran his thumb across the strings, tested the tuning pegs. One string flat, just as he thought. He adjusted it. Calm, precise, the way his father used to. He tucked the violin under his chin, raised the bow. Whitfield folded her arms. "Whenever you're ready, Mr. Brooks." Vincent's voice was barely a whisper, but every microphone in the room picked it up. "I've been ready my whole life." 3 seconds of silence. The bow touched the string. The first note was ugly. There's no other way to say it. The cheap violin fought him from the first stroke of the bow. The tone was thin, scratchy, hollow, like dragging a nail across a chalkboard wrapped in tissue paper. The E string buzzed against the warped bridge. The body of the instrument had no resonance, no warmth, no depth. It was a $40 violin doing exactly what a $40 violin was built to do. Disappoint. A few guests shifted in their seats. Someone at a front table exhaled through their nose, the polite version of a laugh. Theodore Grimes leaned toward a donor and whispered, just loud enough, "This is painful." Whitfield stood at the side of the stage with her arms crossed. Her chin was up. Her smile hadn't moved. This was going exactly the way she'd planned. For about 8 more seconds, because something happened in the 9th second that nobody in that room expected. Vincent adjusted. Not the violin. Himself. His bow pressure shifted, lighter on the attack, heavier on the sustain. His left hand moved a fraction of a millimeter closer to the bridge, changing the contact point. His wrist loosened. His shoulder dropped, and the scratchy, thin, dying sound of that cheap violin began to change. Not all at once, not like flipping a switch. It was more like watching water find its way through cracks in a wall, slowly, then suddenly, then everywhere at once. The tone warmed. The buzz disappeared. A second voice appeared underneath the melody, a double stop, 2 strings ringing together in a harmony so clean it didn't sound like it could come from the instrument he was holding. Vincent's spine straightened, his eyes closed, and the trembling in his bow hand stopped completely. The room noticed, not with applause, not with gasps, with silence. A different kind of silence than before. The first silence was pity. This silence was attention. The melody was simple at the beginning, almost a hymn. Gentle, rocking, the kind of thing you'd hear drifting from a church on a Sunday morning, in a neighborhood where nobody locked their doors. A few notes, repeated. A phrase answered by another phrase, like a conversation between a father and a son. Then it began to grow. The hymn melody folded into something richer, more complex. The rhythm shifted, a syncopation in the bowing that felt like a heartbeat speeding up. The left hand climbed higher on the fingerboard, pulling notes from a register that the cheap violin had no business reaching. But it reached, because Vincent's fingers told it to. And then, recognition. It started at one table. A woman in her 60s, a retired music professor from Temple University, tilted her head, her brow furrowed. She leaned toward her husband and whispered something. He frowned, listened harder. At another table, a music critic for the Philadelphia Inquirer, a man who had reviewed every major performance in the city for the past 20 years, set down his pen. His mouth opened slightly. He looked at Whitfield, then back at Vincent, then back at Whitfield, because the piece Vincent was playing sounded familiar. Not just familiar, unmistakable. It was the Whitfield Violin Sonata in D minor, the same piece that had won Dr. Eleanor Whitfield every award on her shelf. The same piece performed at competitions worldwide. The same piece taught in master classes from Juilliard to Vienna. But it wasn't the same. It was older, rougher, rawer. Like hearing the original recording of a song you'd only ever heard as a cover. The bowing was more daring, longer strokes, riskier string crossings, the kind of phrasing that conservatory training teaches you to smooth out. The double stops were harder, more dissonant, sitting on the edge of beauty and pain at the same time. The melody didn't just move, it ached. It breathed. It stumbled and caught itself and kept going, the way a real human voice does when it's telling you something it's never told anyone before. This wasn't the Whitfield Sonata. This was what the Whitfield Sonata was stolen from. This was Clarence Brooks's sonata, the original, written in pencil 30 years ago, by a self-taught black violinist who played on sidewalks and in churches and at funerals and never, not once, set foot on a stage like this one. The difference between the two versions was the difference between a photograph and the thing it photographs. Whitfield's published version was polished, sanitized, technically flawless. She had filed down every rough edge, smoothed every emotional spike, turned a living, bleeding piece of music into something safe enough for a competition jury. Clarence's version wasn't safe. It wasn't clean. It was the sound of a man who had nothing. No money, no connections, no degree, no stage. Pouring everything he had into the only thing nobody could take from him. And his son was playing it now, on a $40 violin, in a room full of people who had given a standing ovation to the woman who stole it. Professor Gerald Aston sat 2 tables from the stage. His champagne glass had been untouched for 5 minutes. His right hand was pressed over his mouth. His eyes were wet. He knew. He'd known the moment the second movement began, because Gerald Aston had heard this piece before. Not in a concert hall, not on a recording. In a church. Mount Olive Baptist, 1994. A Saturday afternoon. A tall man in a flannel shirt, eyes closed, playing a violin that was held together with tape and prayer. Aston had walked in by accident, looking for the pastor about a fundraiser. He'd stayed for 45 minutes. He never forgot the melody. And for 28 years, every time he heard the Whitfield Sonata performed, something in the back of his mind itched. Something felt wrong. Something felt borrowed. Now he knew why. The room was changing. You could feel it. The way you can feel a tide turning before you see the water move. Whispers rippled from table to table. People leaned forward. Forks rested on plates. Phones were being held up, not to scroll, not to text, to record. Vincent played through the second movement. Every note landed like a fingerprint, proof of origin, proof of authorship, proof that this music had a father, and his name wasn't Whitfield. And then he reached the bridge. In Whitfield's published version, the bridge section was a technically impressive series of arpeggios, fast, clean, the kind of passage that made competition judges nod and scribble high marks on their scorecards. It was impressive. It was safe. It was furniture. In Clarence's version, the real version, the bridge was something else entirely. A cascading descent on the G string, the lowest, darkest string on the violin. The notes fell like stones dropped into deep water, heavy, slow, each one sinking further than the last. It didn't sound like music. It sounded like grief. Like a man standing at a window watching something he loved disappear down a street and knowing it wasn't coming back. Vincent reached the top of that descent. His bow hovered 1 millimeter above the G string, not touching, not moving. The room went silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silent where you can hear the ice settling in water glasses 3 tables away. The kind of silent where you become aware of your own heartbeat and wonder if the person next to you can hear it too. 3 seconds passed. They felt like 30. This was the moment. The breath before the fall. The bow dropped, and the sound that came out of that $40 violin was something that no one in that ballroom would ever forget for the rest of their lives. The G string growled. Not buzzed. Growled. Low and deep and raw, vibrating through the wooden stage, through the floor, through the legs of 400 chairs, and into the chests of 400 people who had forgotten how to exhale. The bow pulled the note longer than seemed possible, a sustained cry that bent at the edges, shimmering with a vibrato so tight it sounded like the string itself was trembling with rage. Then the descent began, note after note falling, each one darker, each one heavier. The melody didn't just move down the scale, it collapsed, the way a building falls in slow motion, each floor giving way to the one below. Vincent's left hand slid down the neck of the violin in a glissando that sounded like a human voice breaking mid-sentence. And then, without warning, the melody reversed. It climbed. Fast. The bow leaped from the G string to the D, to the A, to the E, the highest, brightest string, and suddenly the room was flooded with sound. Not dark anymore. Not grieving. Soaring. The notes cascaded upward in a run so fast and so clean that a violinist in the audience, a woman who had played with the London Symphony, pressed both hands flat on the table in front of her and whispered, "My God." It was technically astonishing. Runs that violin professors used as textbook examples of virtuosity. Double stops that shouldn't have been possible on an instrument this cheap. Harmonics that rang like bells in a cathedral. But it wasn't the technique that broke people open. It was the emotion. Because this wasn't a performance. This was a conversation. A son talking to a father who couldn't answer. A young man playing the notes that a dead man had written for him before he was old enough to understand them. A woman at a front table pressed a napkin to her eyes. A retired conductor closed his eyes and nodded slowly over and over, like he was hearing a prayer answered after decades of asking. Naomi Sullivan, still sitting at the table by the kitchen doors, had both hands over her mouth, tears running down her face without sound. And Vincent played the final movement. The part that didn't exist in Whitfield's published version at all. 32 extra bars. Clarence's ending. The real ending. A resolution that Whitfield had cut because she didn't understand it, or because she was afraid of what it meant. It was quiet, tender. A lullaby played on a single string, high and sweet and fragile, like a music box winding down in a child's bedroom. A father's last letter to a son who would one day stand on a stage like this one and play it back to the world. The final note hung in the air. Vincent held the bow on the string, pressing just enough to keep it alive. The sound thinned, became a whisper, became nothing. He lowered the violin. The silence that followed lasted 6 seconds. 6 full seconds, where 400 people sat motionless, and no one dared to be the first to make a sound. Then Vincent reached inside his blazer. He pulled out the folded, yellowed manuscript pages. 14 sheets of pencil-written music, creased from being carried against a beating heart for years, and held them up. His voice was steady, quiet, but the microphone carried every word to every corner of that room. This sonata was written by my father, Clarence Brooks, 30 years ago. Every note, every bowing, every phrase. He placed the pages gently on the music stand beside him. He never published it. He never had the chance. He didn't look at Whitfield. He didn't need to. 400 heads turned, slowly, together, like a tide, toward the woman standing at the side of the stage. The woman who had just been given a Lifetime Achievement Award for the music of a dead man she had never credited, never acknowledged, never named. Nobody clapped. Not yet. The room was still processing. 400 brains running the same calculation at the same time, rewinding every note they'd just heard, matching it against every recording of the Whitfield Sonata they'd ever listened to, and arriving at the same impossible, undeniable conclusion. The first person to move was Professor Gerald Aston. He didn't clap. He pushed his chair back. The legs scraped against the marble floor, and the sound cut through the silence like a crack in glass. He stood, slowly, the way a man stands when he's carrying the weight of something he should have said a long time ago. He looked at Vincent. Just looked at him. Then he turned and faced the room. A woman at the next table stood. Then a man 2 rows behind her. Then 5 more. Then 10. Then the entire left side of the ballroom rose like a wave that couldn't be stopped. The applause didn't start as applause. It started as one pair of hands, a retired cellist near the back, meeting once, then twice, Then the sound multiplied, table by table, row by row, until it was a roar. Not polite, not rehearsed, the kind of applause that comes from the gut, from the place where people store the things they feel but don't know how to say. Some people were crying. They weren't embarrassed about it. The music critic from the Philadelphia Inquirer had stopped writing. His phone was already recording. He'd send the first draft of his story before midnight. Professor Aston walked to the stage. His steps were slow but deliberate. He reached Vincent, looked at the manuscript pages on the music stand, and studied them. The pencil handwriting, the date, the small note at the bottom of the last page. For V, when he's ready. Aston's voice was quiet, but he was standing close enough to the microphone that every word carried. I knew Clarence Brooks. I heard him play this piece at Mount Olive Baptist in 1994, on a violin just as old as this one. He paused, swallowed. I never forgot that melody, and now I know why it sounded so familiar all these years. The room exhaled, not relief, reckoning. And then, Whitfield. She was still standing at the side of the stage, but she wasn't the same woman who had thrown that violin case 20 minutes ago. The color was gone from her face, not flushed, drained, white as the linen on the tables. Her fingers gripped the edge of a cocktail table so hard her knuckles looked like they were trying to break through her own skin. The crystal plaque, the Aston Lifetime Achievement Award, sat in front of her. Under the chandelier light, it didn't look like an honor anymore. It looked like evidence. Theodore Grimes, who had spent the entire evening orbiting her like a moon that couldn't exist without her gravity, took one step backward, then another. He wasn't standing beside her anymore. The distance was small, 3 feet, maybe 4, but everyone who saw it understood what it meant. Whitfield opened her mouth. Her lips moved. Nothing came out. She tried again. Nothing. For the first time in 28 years, Dr. Eleanor Whitfield had no words. Dean Harriet Caldwell rose from her seat, crossed the room, and leaned close to Whitfield's ear. Whatever she whispered, it made Whitfield's jaw tighten like a wire pulled taut. Her eyes darted to the exit, then to the room, then to the floor. She didn't move. A reporter near the stage, young, hungry, already recording on her phone, called out, "Mr. Brooks, what do you want to happen now?" The room held its breath one more time. Vincent was still standing at the microphone, the cheap violin in one hand, his father's manuscript in the other. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. I don't want anything to happen to her. I just want my father's name on his own music. The room broke open. This time it wasn't just applause. It was something deeper. Chairs pushed back, people on their feet. Hands clapping not for a performance, but for a truth that had waited 30 years to be spoken out loud. Naomi Sullivan, still at the table by the kitchen doors, pressed both hands over her mouth. Tears running, shoulders shaking. She whispered it to no one and everyone at the same time. That's my boy. The gala ended early. Not officially. The band still played. The waiters still poured champagne. But the room had changed. The way a room changes after someone opens a window that's been painted shut for decades. The air was different. The conversations were different. People stood in clusters, talking in low voices, glancing at the stage even though it was empty now. The chandelier still glittered. The orchids still sat in their vases. But the evening no longer belonged to Dr. Eleanor Whitfield. It belonged to a dead man named Clarence Brooks, and to his son, who had just given him back his name. Backstage was a narrow hallway with concrete walls and fluorescent lights that buzzed at a frequency designed to make everything feel temporary. Folding chairs leaned against a rack of unused music stands. A catering cart with half-empty coffee urns sat near the door. Vincent was sitting on one of those folding chairs, alone. His blazer draped over his knees, the cheap violin resting in its battered case beside him, still open, like it hadn't finished saying what it needed to say. His father's manuscript pages were back in his pocket, pressed against his chest, where they always were. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, not from adrenaline, from something he didn't have a word for yet, something that felt like setting down a weight he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it was there. He stared at his fingers, the calluses on the tips, thick and hard from years of pressing steel strings. The same fingers that scrubbed dishes on weekends, the same fingers that gripped a mop handle at the restaurant when the dishwasher broke and they needed someone to clean the floor. The same fingers that had just made a $40 violin sing in front of 400 people. The door opened. Naomi. She didn't say anything at first. She just walked in, pulled a folding chair next to his and sat down, close enough that their shoulders touched. For a long time they just sat there, two people in a fluorescent hallway, listening to the muffled sound of a world rearranging itself on the other side of the wall. Then Naomi spoke. "Your dad would have lost his mind tonight." Vincent laughed. A real laugh. The first full, unguarded laugh we've heard from him in this entire story. It came from somewhere deep and surprised even him. He would have told me I rushed the bridge. Naomi smiled, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Yeah, he probably would have. They sat there a little longer, saying nothing, needing nothing. The next morning, Vincent's phone buzzed at 6:14 a.m. An email. From the Caldwell Foundation, the private arts fund named after Dean Harriet Caldwell's family. He read it 3 times before the words stopped blurring. A full graduate fellowship, tuition, housing, a monthly stipend, a recording budget. No audition required. The email was 4 paragraphs long, but the sentence that mattered was 1 line near the end. Your artistry speaks for itself, and it is long overdue that it be heard. Vincent set the phone down on his mattress, picked it up, read it again. By noon, a second email arrived. This one from a recording label. Not a major, but a respected independent, with a catalog of critically acclaimed classical albums. They wanted to know if Vincent would be interested in recording the complete works of Clarence Brooks for solo violin. Every piece, every fragment, every melody pulled from the back of a church bulletin and the margin of a school notebook. His father's music. In a studio. On a real recording. Under his father's name. Vincent closed his laptop and pressed his palms against his eyes. That evening, the Philadelphia Inquirer published the story. The headline read, "The Sonata That Wasn't Hers. A Student's Performance Reveals a 30-Year Deception." By morning, it had been shared 40,000 times. By the end of the week, music scholars at 3 universities had begun re-examining Whitfield's entire catalog. The Aston Conservatory issued a formal statement. The Lifetime Achievement Award was quietly rescinded. Dr. Eleanor Whitfield did not return to campus that semester, or the next. Vincent called his mother on Sunday, 7 p.m., same as always. Dolores answered on the second ring, still in her hospital scrubs, still smelling like iodine and floor cleaner. He told her everything. The gala, the violin, the manuscript, the standing ovation, the fellowship, the recording offer. She was silent for a long time, so long that Vincent checked his phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Then she spoke. Her voice was steady, the way it was always steady, even when the world wasn't. "Your father used to say the music would find its way home." She paused, took a breath. "I just didn't know it would take this long." Vincent pressed the phone against his forehead, closed his eyes, breathed. Outside his window, the L train rattled past. The apartment shook. The radiator clanked its broken drumbeat. But for the first time in a very long time, the room didn't feel small. 1 week later, 4:53 a.m. The streets of West Philadelphia were still dark, still wet. The same cold that crawled in through your shoes and sat in your bones. Vincent walked the same 6 blocks, past the check-cashing place, past the laundromat with the busted sign, past the corner where Mr. Walton sold newspapers from a folding chair. He pushed open the door of Mount Olive Baptist Church. But this time, he wasn't alone. 3 kids were sitting in the front pew. Neighborhood kids, 10, 11, 12 years old, each one holding a violin, rented, scuffed, cheap. The kind of instrument that sounds like a screen door in a windstorm. The kind of instrument that nobody expects to make beautiful music. The kind of instrument that was thrown at Vincent's feet 1 week ago. A girl, 9 years old, front row, feet not touching the floor, looked up at him with wide brown eyes. "Can you teach me?" Vincent set down his father's violin case, opened it, lifted the instrument, the same one Clarence Brooks had played on sidewalks and in churches and at funerals for 20 years. He tucked it under his chin. Then he nodded at her. "Put it under your chin, just like this." She did. "Now the bow. Light. Don't squeeze. Let it breathe." She tried. The first note was scratchy, thin, ugly, the kind of sound that makes people wince. Vincent smiled. "Perfect. That's exactly how it starts." Vincent Brooks didn't win that night because he was louder. He didn't win because he was angrier. He won because he picked up the cheapest instrument in the room and told the truth with it. His father's music wasn't lost. It was waiting. Waiting for the right hands, the right moment, the right room full of people who needed to hear it. Sometimes the only thing standing between invisibility and recognition is one person brave enough to play, no matter what they hand you. If this story made you feel something, if it made you think about your own moment, your own stage, your own song that nobody's heard yet, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, because every week we tell a story about someone who was counted out and proved that counting wrong. Share this with someone who's been underestimated, and tell me in the comments, what's the talent you carry that the world hasn't seen yet? And remember, keep playing, even when they hand you the cheapest instrument in the room. Hashtag Justice for Clarence Brooks.
Vincent didn't go on to that stage to destroy anyone. He got up there to bring his father home. Clarence Brooks played on sidewalks, in churches, at funerals, for free, no degree, no state, and the one person who recognized his genius stole it for 28 years. But here's the thing about truth: you can bury it, put your name on it, collect awards for it, but you can't kill it, because it lives in the hands of the people who love the person you took it from. They threw a $40 violin at his son's feet, and his son picked it up and played the truth. How many Clarence Brookses are out there right now, brilliant, invisible, unnamed? And how many of us are carrying something pressed against our chest? What if that moment never comes with a spotlight? Does the music still matter? Tell me in the comments. What is the truth you carry that the world haven't heard that? Subscribe. Share this with someone who's been counted out, because sometimes justice doesn't come with a label, it comes with a bow across a screen.